Okay. I'm gonna get started now. It's quite exciting. We haven't had a in-person BIAA lecture since before COVID, since I think February 2020, where immediately afterwards our presenter started feeling unwell, and we were quite worried we had imported the first case of COVID to Turkey. Luckily, it wasn't ever confirmed that COVID was what he was suffering from. And anyway, after that point, we obviously cancelled our in-person lecture series and went entirely online. And the online lectures have been a challenge, of course, but something really rewarding in that we've been able to reach out to a much bigger audience than we could ever gather in this, limited room. What we're doing today is, again, something new, which is a hybrid lecture, which means I'm simultaneously addressing the people in this room as well as some of our online audience. So apologies if I get my wires crossed, because it's sort of like existing on two separate planes, and there's a danger that I drop my focus on people online because of things happening in the room, or vice versa. But let's try it. I'm really glad that this lecture this evening, that we open this season of public events with, is going to be presented by John McManus, who has had a very long relationship with the British Institute. He arrived here in 2016 as a postdoctoral fellow after finishing his PhD at the University of Oxford, which focused on, if I'm not mistaken, Besiktas supporter groups in the UK. During his postdoc, he worked it was an in-depth look at Turkish football and the Turkish football. And he's moved on to the topic which we'll be talking about tonight, which is an investigation of the society of Qatar in the run-up to becoming, in very important amount of time, and into the second book, which, well, let me grab it so that the people online can see it too. It's inside Qatar. Stories from one of the richest nations on earth, and it's in the room to those of very of recent years. I would like to invite John up now to start his lecture, and I hope everyone enjoys it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Daniel, that introduction, and thank you more broadly to the BIAA. As Daniel said, it's been my home for 6 years now, but not for too much longer, because I'm actually leaving Turkey at the end of October. So this is kind of a final swan song, and it's given me so much over the past 2 years, not least the time and space to write 2 books, which is incredibly hard to find in today's academia, but more importantly, just a lot of camaraderie and support and help from all the staff at the centre. So thank you all very much. This talk today is based on my new book, Inside Qatar, which came out in July. And you might be thinking, well, how did someone at the BIAA, that is the British Institute at Ankara, end up writing a book about Qatar? As Daniel said, I'm sort of an anthropologist of sport and migration. Started off very much looking at Turkish communities in Europe and football, and then football in Turkey. And then after that, setting my eyes on the Middle East more broadly. The World Cup is obviously, the FIFA World Cup is going to be happening in Qatar in just over a month's time. And it felt like a place which was not very well understood. On the one hand, we have these quite polarizing views of the place. So a lot of negative coverage in the press, in the Western press, about labour rights, and then a lot of quite fierce response from kind of the Qatari government. And the premise of the book was to try and understand basically the lives of normal people living in the country. It's a non-academic book aimed at outsiders, and the talk subsequently basically assumes no knowledge of Qatar. So if you have, if you want further information or you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A. But seeing as this is a bit outside of the BIAA's normal territory of focus, I decided to keep it quite accessible. And all the names mentioned in the presentation, apart from one, which I will mention, are pseudonyms. So they're not the real names of the people in question. So today's talk is going to be divided into 5 sections. And this is the 5 important, so I'm getting a lot of P's in the microphone. Maybe back, yeah. 5 important themes I want people to understand about Qatar. So without further ado, let's get going. Yeah, so despite hosting the Football World Cup, Qatar's most popular sport is cricket. So this is Ali. In Qatar, when you need to buy a cricket bat, everybody tells you the same thing: call Ali. Diminutive, polite, with a thickish beard and messy hair, Ali works primarily in accounts for a tourism agency, but his real passion is designing and selling cricket products out of his apartment, a small room on the outskirts of Doha. So the most important fact that people need to know about Qatar, if you don't remember anything else, you should try and remember this, is that 89% of the population are migrants. And of that 89%, the largest proportion come from South Asia. So that is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. 1.8 million people, or about 55%, come from those countries. And as some of you might know, the most popular sport in South Asia is cricket. Cricket, originally an English game, but today far, far more popular and more powerful in South Asia than in England. So given that the majority population of Qatar is South Asian, the most popular game in the country is cricket, not football. So cricket makes an interesting comparison to football, because the World Cup, as many people know, billions of dollars have been spent getting Qatar ready, building the stadiums and the roads. But by contrast, cricket remains quite a low-key affair. So the Qatar Cricket Association, who run the game, has an annual budget of mere hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are no professional cricketers in Qatar. Players on the national team have to have day jobs and train in the evenings. And as this picture demonstrates, there are only a handful of proper facilities, meaning that most cricketers are forced to play on car parks, building sites, and other rudimentary scraps of land. So what is the reason for this? I mean, firstly, Qataris are not particularly interested in cricket. But I think that also the neglect for cricket speaks to a wider ambivalence in Qatar towards people in the country from South Asia. So for those not aware, the Gulf and India have been intimately entwined for millennia. And for most of that time, it was India that was the wealthy powerhouse. So India supplied the wood used for building Gulf boats and houses, and the cloth in which Gulfies dressed. Indian money lenders financed Gulf projects. And as late as the 1960s, the main currency used in the region was not the pound, It wasn't the dinar or the rial, but it was actually the Indian rupee. So many recent years, the economic miracle of the Gulf has been generated on the back of millions of people, mostly men, migrating from South Asia to the staff everything, from the oil rigs and the gas pipelines to hotels and shopping malls. And being so largely outnumbered makes many in Qatar feel insecure. That's not surprising, I think. And I think it's one of the reasons behind why Qatar, like most of the Gulf nations, views its relationship with a lot of its South Asian population in transactional terms. You're here to help the country grow and make money for yourselves. But culturally, there aren't really the mechanisms in place for long-term belonging. The long-term belonging is not really what is wanted. Yet the remarkable thing about cricket in Qatar is the resourcefulness with which South Asians have dealt with the lack of state support. So as some of these pictures are showing, they have generated a version of the game based around playing with a tennis ball, which is less expensive and easier to play than the official version. And there are tens of these tennis ball leagues, each of which has multiple games, meaning like any weekend in Qatar, thousands of people are involved in these tennis ball cricket matches taking place in the country. And this is an entirely bottom-up phenomenon, formed and organized by enthusiasts, financed in part by local South Asian businessmen. And within the game, a lot of Pan-Asian solidarity is on display. So even without the state support, cricket is and will remain the backbone of life for thousands of South Asians living in Qatar. So, section 2, falcons. So this is Nasser, a Qatari man in his 50s with his falcon. So I had the fortune of being taken out by Nasser to watch him train his birds. As some of you might know, falconry has a long history in the Middle East, going back centuries. The sport even appears in the Quran, which says that believers can eat, quote, what you have taught your hunting birds and beasts to catch, end quote. So falconry in today's Qatar is a far cry from early hunting trips. It takes place with lots of technological equipment, such as 4x4s and radio and antenna. Birds also cost quite a bit of money. This one, displayed in the picture, does anybody want to guess?
$20,000.
$35,000. NASA has 5. Qataris often race, or some Qataris race their best specimens in competitions where the prizes are as much as a brand new car. And when they're unwell, there's a state subsidized hospital which provides treatment for them at low cost. So these birds of prey have become a hobby and a status symbol and a source of bonding amongst men. Women are conspicuously absent in the falconry world, and even totems of the nation. So to understand the importance of falconry in today's Qatar, one is to bear in mind the size and speed of change that the country has undergone. So before the 1950s, Qatar was one of the poorest places on earth. With a climate which is unsuited for growing almost anything, the economy was based almost entirely around pearl diving. Don't know what the Turkish is for pearl. India. There we go. Yes, but that industry collapsed in the 1920s when a Japanese man discovered how to grow pearls. And then after the Wall Street crash, Qatar's population plunged. Barely anybody lived there. And then in 1939, oil was discovered. In 1949, oil exports began. And then in the 1970s, Qatar found out that it was just south of one of the largest natural gas reservoirs in the world, the North Field, which is shared with Iran in the middle of the Gulf. So Qatar today is one of the biggest exporters of liquefied natural gas. And as a result, it's become incredibly wealthy incredibly quickly. So profitable has the income been that the Qatari government doesn't need to tax citizens. Qatar protects its wealth by also making citizenship by birth or naturalization almost impossible to obtain. And mechanisms have been created for distributing the largesse in the form of free university education, generous gifts of land upon marriage, and well-paid jobs in the state sector. Politically, the wealth has tampered demands for democracy. Qatar is a hereditary monarchy. And socially, the change in lifestyles has been destabilizing, where elderly, I met some families in which elderly Qataris remember having no running water, and their grandchildren race sports cars down the street. There's also been, as mentioned, a huge influx of migrants. The population of Qatar has roughly doubled every decade, slowing down a little bit in recent times. Right now, it stands at close to 3 million. And of that number, Qataris are estimated to be about 350,000. So I think it's helpful to think of falconry in Qatar as a form of invented tradition. So the term, for those not aware, comes from the historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger, and their argument was that many traditions that appear to be old are in fact recently manufactured. And the reason for their creations are various: to establish social cohesion, legitimate institutions and authorities, or inculcate certain value systems. I think along these lines, today's falconers should be seen less as direct descendants of men who roamed the peninsula years ago, and more the proponents of new traditions, of displays of status linked to consumption, of a class of people divorced from worries about income, wondering instead what to do with their leisure time. So crucially, Hobsbawm and Ranger suggest that such inventions occur more readily in societies undergoing great social change. And I think every day in Qatar, there's a battle being waged within this small community of nationals over the question, who are we and what do we stand for? And I think proponents of falconry argue that it's a shared cultural touchstone, one of the few threads that can link the present and the past, and consequently an important vehicle for passing on Qatar's traditional values of thrift and self-denial and egalitarianism, which the older generation hold so clearly. As we drove back home from this falconry expedition with Nasser, he talked to me about his 14-year-old son, who was so different in mentality and outlook from himself. When he's sitting with you, he speaks about politics, he speaks about business all the time. This child, he likes business, said Nasser, seemingly very confused as to why his child was like this. And as he kind of contrasted their lives, he sounded almost rueful when he said, it's a different life, different 100%. Okay, so section 3, labour rights. So this is Reka Bahadur Sunar. That's his real name. He is from Nepal and 47 years old, and wanted me to mention his name whenever I presented about him. So Reka went to Qatar in 2009 to work to support his wife and 6 children. So on the 12th of November 2018, whilst he was erecting scaffolding in a petrochemical plant, he was badly burnt in a work accident and suffered life-changing injuries. 3 other workers died, but he survived, largely thanks to the fact he was wearing the correct protective equipment. So Rekka's employer initially responded well, providing him with a salary and arranging transport for him to attend his daily doctor appointments. But on a trip home to Nepal in 2020, Rekka told me that changed. I think largely due to the coronavirus pandemic, the company began laying off staff due to a lack of work. And despite wanting to come back to Qatar to finish his treatment for the burns, Rekka found himself pressured into signing papers terminating his contract. He now sits at home, unable to work, and is reliant on his adult children for his sustenance. So perhaps the main thing that outsiders know about Qatar in recent years is that it has come in for fierce criticism as to the way low-income workers in the country are treated. A lot of the issues stem from the system of sponsorship-based employment the country uses, which is known often by the Arabic name of kafala. So under the kafala system, every non-citizen, even if you're a American PR consultant earning a small fortune, everybody needs a sponsor in order to be in the country. And this means that private individuals rather than the state has a responsibility for the worker's status. And workers are kind of bound to their sponsors in arrangements that make it difficult for the worker to raise complaints or change jobs. And there has been moves to change elements of this system, which I will speak about shortly. But historically, this system is the underpinning structural factor in the kind of exploitation and abuse that many workers in Qatar have experienced. And from there, the injustices leak out and suffuse the entire arc of migration to the Gulf. So, for instance, take recruitment fees. So to work in Qatar, many workers pay a recruitment fee, despite this practice being illegal and prohibited. And these fees are normally around $1,000 to $1,500, which is a huge amount of money, which most workers can't pay up front. So in turn, they have to borrow, take out loans or arrange to borrow from friends and family. Rekka borrowed 200,000 rupees, which was over $1,600 from the people in his village, because people like him don't get credit from Nepali banks. When these workers arrive, sometimes they find their passports are confiscated, despite that also being illegal. And many workers are also subjected to contract substitution, where the contract that they signed in their home country has disappeared and is replaced by a new agreement with less favorable terms. Most low-income workers live in labor camps, securitized self-contained compounds on the outskirts of Doha. Much of this accommodation is in poor state. It's overcrowded and dirty. This is a picture of a very good labor camp, which is one reason why I was allowed to visit, because it was a shining example where workers had green space and the buildings are clean. But unfortunately, many are not as well looked after as this. Late or non-payment of wages is perhaps the most important issue that workers in Qatar face. I lost count of the number of people I spoke to who had not been paid on time. Some had backlogs of over half a year's pay. And now it's important to realize that most workers in Qatar are the sole source of income for their families. So if that worker receives their wages late or not at all, it doesn't just affect them, but it results in missed meals and unpaid school fees half the world away. So as I mentioned, under pressure from the International Labour Organization and various media sources, Qatar has overhauled its labour laws over the past decade. The World Cup has obviously been a great catalyst to highlighting the situation. So Qatar's introduced electronic oversight of salary payments to try and stop this non-payment. It increased accommodation and worksite inspections. It's introduced the minimum wage. It's removed the requirement to get permission from your employer before you change jobs. And this is all obviously great and to be welcomed. But there is unfortunately a catch, which is that the laws now in place are sound, but they are not being enforced with the rigor that most workers would like to see. So even now, NGOs are reporting problems with unpaid wages and difficulty with workers changing jobs. And there seems to be growing pushback from employers who are finding other ways to try and limit workers' agency. And importantly, when you think of Qatar and labor, the image that comes to mind is often, workers in the construction industry. They've received a lot of the attention, partly because they're the ones who've been building the stadiums. But it's important to realize that this affects everyone really in Qatar, especially amongst low paid workers. And it's worse for other groups, particularly domestic workers. So because domestic work is governed by separate laws, domestic workers have been systematically left outside of the scope of improvements. Because they work alone, they often face a high risk of exploitation, and they also face like a triple whammy of discrimination as low-income workers, as people of color, and as women. Most domestic workers they're overwhelmingly women, 80-90%. So in the words of one domestic worker I met, I want to end this section on. She was called Maggie, and she was from Kenya. And she spoke just very powerfully of kind of the feelings that domestic workers often have about their situation in Qatar. And she said, "Here you are caged. You are being told to do this and do that. You see yourself like you are no good. We lost self-esteem, and most domestic workers are always stressed and depressed." Section 4, Qatari. In October 2019, I attended a forum on labour in Qatar. This is a very bad picture, but unfortunately it's the only one I have. So I watched as a government minister took the microphone, and he told the audience about the raft of new laws that were about to be introduced. "There were red lines in the past in the state of Qatar," he said proudly, "but we have undoubtedly made a quantum leap in this regard. It is impossible for us to go back." The microphone was then passed to another Qatari, and with the audience sitting dumbfounded, he launched into a repudiation of everything the first speaker had just praised. "If you completely abolish exit permits," he told us, "what would stop an employer going to the bank, withdrawing 1 million riyals from the company account, getting on a plane and leaving the country? Qatar," he told us, "was a unique case. My country, my community, my society is different. We need time to adapt." So what was unusual about this exchange was that it made public what everybody knew kind of happens behind closed doors, namely that there are extreme battles amongst Qataris as to how far to go with labour reforms. So even though they comprise only about 350,000 people, it would be a grave mistake to view the Qataris as monolithic group. There are divisions in opinion, and they speak to profoundly different worldviews which are taking place amongst the citizens. So on the whole, Qatari society is relatively conservative. Most Qataris are remarkably religious. Life in the country is punctuated by visible displays of Islam. Radio broadcasts, for instance, are interrupted to play the call to prayer, as is the music in shopping malls. There are notices and pictures in most public buildings reminding people how to dress appropriately. And only 61% of married Qatari women under 50 were in favour of contraception, according to a 2011 study. Yet there are sizable numbers whose outlook has been shaped by the country's recent drive towards modernisation. So, as I mentioned, Qataris can go to university for free. Many have received Western-based education, either abroad or at campuses of US universities, which now are in Doha, like Cornell, Northwestern, Georgetown. 3 times as many Qatari women as men graduate from these universities, and women are encouraged by the state to work. I think it's important not to simply think that the younger generation are more liberal than their forefathers. It's not so simple. The current emir, for instance, Sheikh Tamim, is widely considered to be more conservative in outlook than his father, Sheikh Hamad. And the youth are some of the fiercest defenders of kind of traditional, the primacy of tribal identity. So, for instance, in a survey of university students in 2010, many young university students considered tribal identity important when choosing a life partner and would not want their own children to marry into quote unquote a lower tribe. So I should say briefly, just a side note on tribes. So tribes are like an imagined grouping of like tens of thousands of people strong, and within Qatar, there are tens of different tribes to which people feel belonging. And the most prominent is the Al Thani tribe, which is from which the family who rule the country come from. But there are many, many more, and they have very different histories, you know, some which originate from Iran or even Sudan. And, you know, it's a very complicated past, and people feel identity often to these tribes as well as to the nation state. So the rulers of Qatar pivot from kind of, they have to keep 2 very distinct communities happy. They're trying to push the country forwards in terms of modernization, at the same time, not angering this largely conservative rump of society. And this results in quite, to outsiders, what looks like quite mixed policy. So for instance, new labor laws are passed for workers, allowing workers to leave their jobs. But then the government looks the other way if a sponsor wants to try and limit the movement by other means. A church is opened so that foreigners, Christians in Qatar, can worship. And so the main mosque in Doha is named after Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, the Saudi founder of the ultra-conservative Islamic doctrine of Wahhabism. So there's a need to try and keep everyone on side. And as a result, to be Qatari is often to kind of be hit by extremely different conflicting worldviews. People are inheriting a set of cultural traditions forged in poverty, but living in a world of fast cars, international travel, and government handouts. So at home, children are taught the primacy of the tribe and the collective. And then at school, they're educated in Western curricula that emphasize individual fulfillment. So I ended up, it's probably unfashionable to feel sorry for young Qataris given all the material wealth that they have at their disposal. But at the end of my stay, that was the point I had reached for the most progressive and outward looking ones anyway. It's very difficult for them to navigate this hugely contrasting worlds. And one conversation I remember vividly was with a young Qatari adventurer, a motorcyclist. So he travels the globe on his bike, motorbike, and has ridden basically through every country on earth. And I asked him, what has been the most formative takeaway from his travels? Well, he said, and paused for a second, I've met lots of happier people than us in Qatar. Okay, so this is the 5th and final section, and it looks at Qatar's place in the world. So this is Kumar, or this is Kumar's car. Kumar worked in Qatar for 10 years, the last 2.5 as a taxi driver. A week before he was due to leave Doha for his home in Sri Lanka, he talked to me. And this is a quote. The main reason for the people coming to Qatar is their country is not developed very much, said Kumar. They don't have any jobs in their country. They can't earn enough money in their country. Even me. We can earn money, but it's not enough. It's not enough for our family maintenance. I think Kumar's words are a good introduction to the final point I want to make, which is that the situation in Qatar can't be understood without an appreciation of wider global trends around migration and inequality. Frequently a lot of the media attention focused on Qatar makes it out as if it's some country completely removed from the rest of the world, and when it really isn't. And when speaking to migrant workers like Kumar or Rekha, I was often struck by the sense of inevitability about their decision to move to the Gulf for work. There was little in the way of regret, because the wholly uneven pattern of global development meant that they felt they had no other option but to leave their home country in search of better paying work. It's just what you do if you want to get ahead, if you're born in Nepal or Sri Lanka. And it also needs saying that for all the stories of worker exploitation in Qatar, there are many thousands from the world's poorest nations who make the country work for them. So they're the ones who are fortunate enough to avoid the disreputable brokers, and they're blessed perhaps with a sponsor who pays them on time. If you get that, then you can work, save, and as a result, transform the lives of you and your family. And there are many thousands for whom Qatar has provided this leg up. But Qatar is also a stark example of the perniciousness of contemporary global capitalism. Sorry, I should say as well, Qatar is not the only example of the perniciousness of contemporary global capitalism. The same problems and systems that bring workers to Qatar also compel people to take rickety boats across the Mediterranean from Africa to Europe, or chance their luck with the desert and border guards at the US-Mexico border. And sometimes I find myself thinking if perhaps on the subject of labor exploitation and inequality, Qatar is weirdly more honest. But what do I mean by that? I mean, the world is divided into such distinct spheres, separate and unequal. So you might come to understand very well the inequality within a particular society or country, but especially in Western Europe, that pales into comparison to inequality globally. You can't see global stratification with your own eyes. There is no personal interaction with the Bangladeshi woman who was paid peanuts to make your t-shirt, or the Congolese mining the cobalt, which is in everyone's phone in their pocket right now. But it feels in Qatar as if the extreme wealth and the poverty kind of coexist. The inequity has no place to hide. And so that's what I mean about it feeling weirdly more honest, that you're confronted daily just with the sheer inequality that the globe that is life on the globe. But having said that, the dynamics in Qatar are particularly laissez-faire. When this reality of global inequality interacts with an immigration system that hands too much power to an employer, then the result is a situation that can be easily exploited. And even those who believe that they are safe from abusive practices can suddenly find themselves ensnared. And in wrestling with the situation of workers in Qatar, I kept coming back to the memory of Stephen. So in October 2020, I met Stephen, who was originally from the Philippines, in his flat in Doha. He told me that he worked as a mechanical engineer for a construction company, but that his main calling was serving as a community volunteer, helping Filipinos who get into trouble with work in Qatar. 4 months after our conversation, I heard from a mutual friend that Stephen himself was in trouble. His company hadn't paid his salary for 5 months, and he'd been taken to court by his landlord because he hadn't paid his rent on his flat. So while he was waiting for the court date, a travel ban had been issued against him, meaning he couldn't leave the country. "I just pray in the corner and cry," he wrote to me on WhatsApp. "Why am I suffering like this? I'm working hard with my heart. I'm the community leader helping others for how many years? But now here I am facing the same difficulty." And this is the human impact of this kind of Wild West labor market. You can be sitting pretty and then, through no fault of your own, find yourself destitute, penniless, or deported. And I think that precarity and the fear that stems from it was the most abiding memory from my time researching the book. So, there are, for people at the higher end of the spectrum in Qatar, people like myself, life there, it can be excellent and wonderful. But my abiding memory was this precarity and this fear that unfortunately most people who end up working there feel. And with that, I will finish. Okay, so I'm very willing to and able to answer any questions that people might have, either in the room or online. Please feel free to ask anything. Sure, at the back there.
Thanks so much for this talk. It was super interesting. Did you have to get special permission, like from the Qatari government, to do this research? And what was that like?
So I'm going to repeat the questions just so people online can hear them. The question was, did I have to get any specific permission from the Qatari government to be able to do this research? No, in a word. I was sponsored. So the way that my research was funded, I actually had a grant from an American anthropology foundation to do field work, and a local university sponsored my visa. So I wasn't being paid by them, but they were obviously covering all the paperwork to allow me to stay in the country. I said what I was doing. I didn't like. I think that this is the strange thing about Qatar, that on the one hand, obviously some people have fallen foul of the fact that it's very much not a space where, like, freedom of speech is definitely constrained there, and there are certain red lines. For instance, journalists who have tried to go to labor camps or tried to enter labor camps have often been prevented and sometimes deported for trespassing. So I think that it's two things. On the other hand, I do think that the space for debate and conversation is potentially bigger than people necessarily realize. But it's very difficult to know just because it's not very clearly understood. So I sort of basically aware of those red lines, aware of knowing what would really irritate people. I shied away from them a bit. I didn't I don't have pictures from bad labor camps because I didn't try to enter bad labor camps, because I knew that wouldn't be seen very, that wouldn't be taken very kindly. But at the same time, I didn't have people continually tapping me on the back saying, well, like, why are you doing this research? What are you doing? So yeah, I think that it's a strange place where it exists kind of in this grey area of everything is not constrained, but at the same time, it's certainly not free, and people are very wary, and there's a lot of self-censorship. And I guess I was sort of trying to steer a line through the middle in some ways, and perhaps that's the best way of trying to describe it. So yeah, there's two questions, Daniel, and then Lutz.
Okay.
So yeah, why don't you go first, Daniel?
Okay, sure. I was wondering, because it didn't come up in your talk, but Turkey obviously has a very close relationship to Qatar, especially during the period that Qatar was isolated by the other Gulf states. And I was wondering what reactions you had to your Turkey connection, and whether how the Qataris that you came across or others viewed Turkey. Supposedly they're deploying troops there or gendarmes there for the World Cup. The most recent thing I heard.
Great, yeah. So good question. It was that Turkey and Qatar relations are particularly good at the moment, and he was asking what the response was when people realized that I was based in Turkey or had a connection to Turkey. And the answer is that yes, people were largely positive. I mean, so you talk about the blockade, and it's worth just mentioning this for a minute for those not aware. So in 2017, there's tension between Qatar and its Gulf neighbors, and this has been going on for a long time. So, for instance, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it's quite complex and long why there is this tension. But essentially, a large part of it is differing outlooks on life and supporting different regional actors. So, for instance, in Egypt, Qatar was a big supporter of Mohamed Morsi, if you remember, who came to power after the revolution, whereas Saudi Arabia and the UAE really didn't like Morsi. So there's a tension there, and like they accuse Qatar of basically supporting terrorism, which Qatar denies. But the World Cup features in this as well, because I think there's all of these nations that are trying to use sport to improve their image, and so the fact that Qatar is hosting this prestigious tournament has been seen as an irritant for those nations. So basically, in 2017, these nations just slapped a blockade on Qatar. They cut off the land border. They refused to allow. They removed their diplomats. They refused to allow even Qatar Airways to fly over their territories anymore. All in the hope of trying to get Qatar to concede to some demands, which included things like closing Al Jazeera and various other, changing basically the entire way that it's the country works, which they clearly weren't going to do. And during this time, Qatar was like, oh, who's going to help us? So like so many of the products used for building and food would come in from these countries across the land border. And one of the nations that stepped up was Turkey. And that's, I think that the Erdogan and the ruler of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, have a good relationship. I think just personally have a good relationship. And they're obviously also helped by, and that works, it's become a bit of a quid pro quo in terms of the Qatari investment in Turkey and also business opportunities in Qatar for Turkish companies. And as Daniel said, even in the World Cup, 3,000 Turkish gendarmes are going to be used as part of the security arrangements. So this relationship is now, after, by 2022, pretty well established and pretty pally-pally. And that certainly was great for me. Because it meant that, saying with a link to Turkey, nobody looks unfavorably on Turkey, really. Also, a lot of Qataris come on holiday to Turkey because it's, quite relatively close by and is, a Muslim country, but one in which it's a bit easier to let your hair down. And there's a strong link there. There's basically there's a researcher who's written an entire book about Qatar-Turkey relations because they're quite deep nowadays. It'll be interesting to see when and if Erdogan moves on, if a new government would keep relations in the same frame or how they would change. Look, you had a question, did you?
I had a question, yes. First of all, thank you very much. Then you said that there are about 3 million inhabitants, only just over 10% Qatari, so a minority holding all the power. How do those Qataris see the future? Also looking at being surrounded by migrants, and there seems to be not a very good relationship.
I think it's hard to generalize. I think people have differing views about how the country should go forward. I met Qataris who felt that there was a need, for instance, to start charging taxes so that citizens felt a bit more connected to the nation rather than just, we get money from the nation. And also that there should be better mechanisms to allow long-term residents to stay. If you're born in Qatar, for instance, but your parents are from, let's say, India, you don't really have any right to stay in the country if your parents lose their jobs. So if whoever is the main breadwinner and the sponsor loses their job, then you have to leave sometimes within a month or something. So there's this precarity which makes it really difficult for anyone who is not in the 11% to feel that they truly belong. But as for, but there are some who are perfectly happy with that arrangement. As I said before, you've got, if you were to expand citizenship, for instance, then the pie, you need to share more of the pie, more of the revenues from the hydrocarbons. And, understandably, there are people who are not really willing to do that. And so I was struck a bit by the sort of the transactionalism, or how transactional relations were often, because a lot of these migrants know this before they come and are happy with that. Like, okay, I'm not here to settle down anyway. I'm going to make some money and then I'm going to go home. And that Qatar kind of likes people often to do that. It's like, you come when we want you to come. You do what we want you to do. And, when we're done with you, we can make sure that you leave. But that is right. That often, as someone who comes from a country has many problems, but where there is a route to citizenship. If you live there long enough, or if you marry someone who's from there, you can legally belong there, even if in the eyes of some you never will. I found that profoundly uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with that, and I don't know, like, if in the long term what the implications of that will be. I mean, it's a problem facing all diverse societies. How do you make people feel that they belong? And within Western Europe, for instance, no nation has nailed it when it comes to making sure that everyone who lives there or is a citizen feels that they belong. But yeah, this model is particularly alienating, and one which I found quite hard to understand. But it's not written. It's a bit of a rambling answer. I guess the short answer is that I don't really know, other than that I feel Qatar is missing out, really. A lot of these people are brilliant, they're young, they're hardworking, they have great ideas. Surely you want to try and make those people stay. The wealth is very much reliant on them often. So it's kind of win-win to try and allow these people to feel more that they belong. And I met some people who fundamentally believe that within the 11%, but I feel like the message is not that widely hit home. Three questions. Okay, your hand went up first. Yeah, and then you. Sorry, I don't know your names.
Thomas from Germany. First of all, thanks so much for the presentation, especially with your personal experiences that definitely helped broadening my picture of Qatar that I had. Especially with your background and research background on football. So it would be very interesting to me what your take is on the entire discussion of boycotting the World Cup as a consumer, as a viewer, or as a fan. And if that's not too personal, what your own position towards that would be?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, as someone who's interested in football, what my view is on the whole kind of boycott Qatar movement, boycott Qatar World Cup. Sorry. I think that I understand where a lot of those people are coming from. I don't personally believe in boycotting. I feel that engagement. I think just personality wise, I'm not that confrontational as a person, and so I've always felt that actually engagement is a better route. The problem is, and this is very well publicized problem, is that a lot of the issues surround, like the World Cup, hasn't necessarily been the catalyst for change that people wanted, or that necessarily the Qatari government tries to claim that it has been. There are fundamental problems there, and I understand entirely why some people just want nothing to do with it. So I'm not preachy, or I don't condemn people who are just like, look, I want nothing to do with this. But I think more broadly, I think it's really welcome the extra attention Qatar has received. But global football is a profoundly, corrupt, not particularly nice place. And I worry a little bit, and we'll see in the future, but for instance, the next World Cup will be in USA, Mexico, and Canada. And, what there will be issues surrounding that tournament as well. Like, to what degree will they be emphasized, and to what degree will people really engage with them? I was speaking just last week to a human rights researcher who's wrote a report on hotels in Qatar and the treatment of workers in them, which is often not as good as it should be. And they actually said that there was a report last year about the abuse of workers in hotels in America, which was also very shocking, and which was this is not to engage in some long list of whataboutery in terms of, but I think the point is that, like, the World Cup, I think our bar of criticism, should be higher, and like we should hold everyone to better account. And I feel that, like, just turning one's back on football or on the tournament is not the way to do that. But I do understand that other people disagree, and especially if you're like from a sexual minority, or you're somehow just have a different stance. I can completely understand why your feelings on the matter would be far different to that. That the level of anger might be such that you want nothing to do with it. Was that an
Yeah.
Cool. And yeah, just behind you.
Sure, yeah, Andrew from the US. So my question was, you mentioned it's kind of a younger society, and there's lots of interesting things there. Do you find a lot of the young people want to stay in Qatar and work in their society there, or do you find them to be migration oriented themselves?
Cool. So the question was, you mentioned Qatar was a young place. Do a lot of the young people want to stay and work in Qatar, or are they also looking to migrate? I just ask, are you referring to Qatari citizens?
Yeah, I'm referring to Qatari citizens.
Okay, so yes, within the 11%, very, very few, I think, want to live elsewhere. I mean, why would you? If you live elsewhere, you won't have a public sector job where you work on average from 7:30 in the morning until 2 p.m. And then have the rest of the day off, and where you're paid like a lot of a decent salary for that. You won't have access to all the other perks that come with it. But also, I think that, like, people are so, like I said, like, Qatari society in general is quite, small c conservative in terms of, family is important. And I think that, one's decision is not one's on their own to make. So I think that if someone was to be like, I'm going to live abroad forever, it's one thing to go abroad and study, that's obviously helping, but there's an expectation that you'll come back. And yeah, I met I can count on one hand the number of Qataris who I met who are kind of based abroad and want to be abroad. But maybe it's a self-selecting sample. That's maybe not a good point to make, because I was interested in Qatar itself. I think it'd be interesting to talk to people who don't want to go back. But yeah, I still think they're definitely in the minority. I think most people are, very happy to be, and proud. Qatar is a young nation, and very nationalistic as well. The blockade helped in that matter, in terms of really inspired pride amongst people. So yeah, I don't think seeing many people leaving. Martin, did you have a question?
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about how maybe some of the things that people hoped would happen as a result of the World Cup coming to Qatar hadn't really gone through the way that maybe people thought they would. But when the cameras are literally on the country for a few weeks, and the world's gaze really turns to the country, what do you think kind of the legacy of that is likely to be going into the future, in 5-10 years' time? Do you think any of the changes that have happened will be maintained? Do you think things will continue in a certain direction? Or do you think it will just be a kind of, like London 2012?
So that was a question just about like what's going to happen to Qatar kind of post World Cup, or firstly during the tournament, and then secondly, like, what will the impact be? Will these changes carry on, or will they peter out? I mean, this is the $1 million question, and I I can't answer it with any degree of certainty, which is frustrating. We'll have to see. I mean, I have to, for people more knowledgeable than I am on the ground, who I speak to, there's a lot of people who are worried that the rollback has started now, that there's going to be a sort of like, okay, once everyone's kind of stopped looking at us, we're we go back to how things were before, or at least try to. So that's if that is indeed the case, then that would be disappointing. I don't think the government want that, especially as I pointed out before. The government is often at the vanguard of trying to push through change in Qatar, but at the same time has to obviously tread very carefully. I mean, I think during the tournament, I should say as well, during the tournament itself, I think that Qatar will put on a good show, most likely. I think that fans who travel there will have a good time. I think that they'll pull out the stops to make sure that everything works well. And I think that'll probably work. Might be a few hiccups here or there. But yeah, I don't know about the long-term legacy. I mean, I hope it stays. I hope it improves, basically. But I don't know. There's such huge attention that a World Cup brings to a place, and Saudi Arabia and UAE are two countries which haven't received anything like the same amount of attention on their labor systems over the last 10 years, and they have to degrees made reforms as well. But it'll just be very interesting to see what happens in these countries in terms of the rights of workers going ahead. I remain optimistic, but I'm not I don't sort of. I'm also a bit pessimistic. There's a question at the back.
Do you think Ali or Nasa or other people that you interviewed are going to read the book?
Do I think that Ali, Nasa, and other people I've interviewed are going to read the book? No. I think because most people don't read books. Most of these people are aware that the book has come out, and obviously I told people when I was meeting them that I was writing a book. But yeah, my experience also with my Turkish football book is that most people out there don't really read books. It's a sort of quite an elite pursuit. Increasingly so, especially this type of book. So yeah, sadly not. I think hopefully a lot of people who follow football and the World Cup will read it. But yeah, I think that it actually speaks to a larger point of kind of outsiders in Qatar, and I wish that there was a book written on Qatar by someone who was from South Asia or who was even Qatari, for instance. And unfortunately, there just isn't a lot of perspective from these angles in written form. Largely because, as I said, a lot of people are a bit scared of putting something in print. It's very exposing. Which it does make me slightly uncomfortable at times as an outsider talking about a place, and especially as an outsider from a country which colonized Qatar, which I probably should have mentioned in this talk. Qatar was it was a semi part of the British Empire. So anyway, it's important to be aware of one's positionality, I think, when coming into these things. But yeah, I'm not sure that those guys will read it. Cool. Okay, one question at the front, and maybe we can take it outside and have some drinks and things. And there's no questions online I can see as well. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I thought you made a really interesting point earlier, talking about workers helping each other in their respective communities. Do you think there is a really realistic approach to improving the labor rights in Qatar? Maybe talking about the possibility of unionizing or some concepts like that. Did you maybe hear about some thoughts about
So the question is just about workers supporting one another, or people in Qatar supporting one another. I guess the cricket example. And did I hear of any other examples of workers doing things like unionizing and things? And the answer is no. I didn't, and I don't think that there would be any systematic attempts like that for the short reason that trade unions are legal. They're legal for Qataris, but they're illegal for everyone else. So, like, structurally, I don't see how that could happen in a kind of constructive, formal manner, which is a shame. Obviously, I think everybody should have the right to form a trade union if they want to, or be part of a trade union. And occasionally, it's not. There have been strikes or sit downs by workers. When you realise that maybe after this talk, you realise more clearly that the penalties for straying could be like deportation very easily. So when you realise that the risks is that high, when people do sit down or do go on strike, you realise that they must be really fed up, really pushed to the limit. So I think that it's a shame that there aren't more constructive routes for people to do this. But I don't know. And like, if there was a Qatari government spokesman here now, they would probably point to the workers within the World Cup project, who they have kind of workers' commissions where they can feed back complaints to their specially appointed workers. And within the 10% or so of the 5% of the population who worked on the stadiums and the other World Cup stuff, they did have mechanisms, but I don't see much evidence of that being rolled out through society more broadly. So yeah, I can't be too positive on that. No. Cool. Well, yes. I think that thank you again, everyone, for coming, and thank you to the BIAA for having me to my sort of farewell swan song to present on this new book. Thanks for listening attentively and asking good questions. And yeah, I think we'll go outside. Sorry to those of you watching online, but those here will move to some liquid refreshment, and very happy to answer any further questions.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, as mentioned, people in the room can move into the hallway where there's some snacks, and the people online, thanks for listening, and please follow our events program so that you can join future lectures. This is the first of several hybrid lectures for the rest. We've got for the rest of the year lined up, and if you haven't done so already, join our mailing list or follow our Twitter and other social media to find out about those. Thanks.